Back with us, General H.R. McMaster. All right, I want to end or begin where I ended a moment ago, and this is the struggle for self-worth. You write, I came to see Trump's embrace of Duterte and his berating me in the hotel room and the beast as connected to his struggle for self-worth. If he was accepted by strongmen like Duterte, Putin, and Xi, he might convince others, and especially himself, that he was strong. An attempt to elicit anxiety or anger in me through derogation may have been a response to his sense of losing control. Struggle for self-worth. Explain that to me. What did it look like up close?
Well, I mean, there's a certain fragility in his ego, and I've been a student of presidential character, and I had written a book, Katie, years ago about how and why Vietnam became an American war. And it was a study of Lyndon Johnson's decision-making and the decisions that led to an American war in 1964 and 1965. And much of the book was about President Johnson's interaction, interaction between his personality and his character, with the complex problems set in Vietnam and with his principal advisors. And in that environment that led to an American war in Vietnam, many of President Johnson's key military and civilian advisors determined to give him the advice he wanted. One of them noting that he gave President Johnson the advice he wanted because, he had to maintain his influence with the president. And so I came into the job, having written about how and why Vietnam became an American war, and I was determined not to do that, not to give the president the advice he wanted. And if he didn't like it, I would get used up. And I was at peace with that. And that part of the story is during a long trip to Asia, where the president, kind of lost his patience and lost his cool with me. And during that conversation, I said, hey, listen, Mr. President, listen, I'm doing the best job I can for you. Whenever you want to let me go, replace me with somebody else, I am completely fine with that. And I think that's a point where he recognized like he wasn't going to have really control over me. And I think that may have angered him a little bit more. But, everybody has, their own personality flaws, character flaws. And with President Trump, I think one of them is that he does seek affirmation, and my shelf life was limited in part because I probably was not the person to give him kind of everything he wanted in that connection.
You're writing about how he had a penchant for pitting people against each other. You talk about how his insecurity made him susceptible to manipulation, especially by foreign leaders. You talk also about how he had a difficult time distinguishing between sound analysis and hackneyed bromides, how he'd always mention a friend who was an expert in X, Y, or Z. Then you talk about this self-worth stuff, and I'm just so surprised, General, that you're still not saying flatly that you don't think he should be president.
Well, because I don't think that's my role, Katie. So here's my concern about that. First of all, it's not my job to tell people how to vote. I don't think. I think what I can do is give you my honest accounting, of my experience while I was National Security Advisor, and let you and other Americans make the choice. Kay, what I'm concerned about, one of the things I'm concerned about these days, besides, how dangerous the world's become, how, whoever's elected president is going to confront a really complex and interconnected set of challenges to our security and our prosperity. But I'm also concerned about the degree to which we're at each other's throats from a partisan perspective. What I try to do with the book, and maybe, it might be just impossible these days, but it is to kind of transcend the vitriol of the partisan politics and just write about my experience and let every reader come to his or her own judgment about the presidential candidate. The story's also, it's about the ugly, and the bad experience, the difficult experiences, but it's not like a woe is me book. I mean, the book is largely about how I helped this disruptive president. We did as part of the national security team to put into place some really significant, long overdue, and what it turns out to be in retrospect, I think wise shifts in U.S. Foreign policy, many of which only became apparent to Americans, the value of them, after the Biden administration reversed them. For example, in the policy and strategy and approach toward Iran, for example. So, hey, it's a mixed bag, Katie, with the candidates we have. I don't want to be the person who tells people how.
I hear
my
you.
editor at one point, Katie, my editor said, hey, this has got to be a warning. I said, no, it's not a warning. It's to inform people, and then people can come to their own conclusions.
I hear you, and I respect that. And given the moment we're living in, I definitely respect people who are trying to rise above it. At the same time, you talk about what a dangerous world this is and the complex set of issues and policies the next president will have to embrace, the world that he'll or she'll have to navigate. And because it is so dangerous, and you know better than anyone, better than I do certainly, why would you not just be clear with the American public on the two candidates? Because it seems like in the interviews I've seen with you is that you're equating Kamala Harris with Donald Trump, saying either one would be perfectly fine. But what you write about in this book is a guy that's not stable, who's not making the best decisions all the time, who's susceptible to flattery. And then you're going out and you're saying he's going to have people that'll surround him, he'll surround himself with, that'll be good at steering him. I don't know how you can say that. Who's left?
Well, I'm not equating them. I think they're quite different candidates. So even though, even though Vice President Harris now sounds a lot like Donald Trump, like building the wall and everything, but I do think they're quite different candidates. And I think people have to make their own decision. I mean, with President Trump, if you think about some of the areas where he has been very consistent, it's been in the area of energy security, for example, or reciprocity in trade, or in burden sharing for allies. And we could all sign up for that, I think, right? But, does he take this focus on burden sharing with allies, too far, or make statements like, hey, I'm not going to defend those who aren't investing 2%? I mean, so, President Trump is disruptive. That's what I write about in the book. A lot of things that he disrupts needed to be disrupted. But of course, he is so disruptive, he tends to disrupt himself, and again, become the antagonist in his own story. So that's the person you get, right? That's the candidate, one of the two major candidates. The other candidate has been part of an administration, I think, that has pursued some unwise policies and has done so in a way that may have exacerbated some of the very significant challenges we're seeing.
But is she a candidate that can distinguish between fact and fiction? Is she a candidate that's susceptible to flattery? Is she a candidate that's going to put people around her that are qualified to be in the position? Donald Trump ended his last administration with a whole lot of people that were not qualified to be there. He fired pretty much everybody that was going against him. He wanted to install Jeffrey Clark to be the acting AG. And he only didn't do so because there was a threatened revolt because he didn't accept the results of the 2020 election. I'm just curious, why are you seem so sanguine about the possibility of another Trump administration? And I'm just wondering how you can be so sanguine.
Hey, Katie, I'm not sanguine about anything these days, believe me. But what I'm looking at is, when you look at the comparison in policies, okay, and of course we're talking about character and personality and how important that is. And it is important. And I write about it extensively in the book. But, how did it make sense, Katie, to cancel a Canadian pipeline and greenlight Nord Stream 2? How did it make sense to relax sanctions enforcement on Iran, and allow about the transfer of about $100 billion, into Iran's coffers to intensify its proxy wars? How did it make sense to undesignate the Houthis or to alleviate sanctions on the Maduro regime, seeing what's happening there? I mean, I could go on about this. It didn't make sense to pull our ships out of the Black Sea and to lay out red lines with Putin in Helsinki, which gives him like a green light on everything else, evacuating our embassy in Kyiv and scuttling our embassy. I mean, I could go on, right? So, hey, I don't. So what I'm saying is, I'm not sanguine about either. And so I think in large measure what we have, and this is up to everybody to assess, is you have kind of either a choice between, Trump's erratic nature, and I describe a lot of that, or what I would describe as a degree of fecklessness, on the part of the Biden-Harris administration in connection with some of these critical, competitions and dangers we're facing in the world today. I think the Biden administration gets credit for a lot of other things. I mean, I think the Biden administration, for example, has taken a strong approach toward the competition with China, which is an element of continuity with the Trump administration. And so, hey, listen, I don't want to be, an advocate for the Democratic or the Republican candidate. I want to contribute to each American's sort of assessment by telling you what I knew. I never served as Vice President Harris's national security advisor. But based on my experience with President Trump, I just told you from my perspective what that experience was, what my observations were. And I hope that helps Americans make the best decision, their own decision.
H.R. McMaster, really good to have you. In terms of the only thing that stood out to me that you just said there, or one of the things is I've had a lot of conversations with this administration and John Kirby, for instance, about that $60 million that we opened up, unfroze for Iran. They were adamant that it wasn't just a pile of cash going into Iran's coffers, that it was goods and that Iran had to request them and they would get the goods. You can argue that getting the goods freed up money in itself, but they didn't just hand over a pile of cash to Iran.
Hey, we do know, though. I mean, cash is fungible, and then also, Katie, it was actually not just the transfer of those billions; it was just not enforcing sanctions, which allowed them, to kind of redouble their stipends to groups like Hezbollah, PIJ, and Hamas, and the Hashd Shabi in Iraq. I mean, it's a humanitarian catastrophe in the whole region, and Iran's behind it. Look at the Syrian civil war. I mean, half the population is dead, wounded, or displaced. What's happening in Yemen? We're focused on the Houthis because of the threat to shipping, but they're starving children to death. The Houthis. I mean, so anyway, it's an absolute catastrophe in the Middle East. And hey, the Biden administration does not deserve the blame for that. I mean, the Iranians deserve the blame for it. Terrorist organizations like Hamas do, but I do think their policies, have contributed, to a perception of weakness, Katie. And one of the titles in the book is that weakness is provocative. And what I'm afraid of is, as we're at each other's throats, as we're at war with ourselves, that will encourage this kind of axis of aggressors that have the world on fire, or threatening to set other parts of the world on fire in the South China Sea, for example. And that's why, our National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was recently in China to help prevent that from happening.